Hey folks, welcome to Set Apart Homestead. This is Travis here at the Prepared Homestead. Before we get started, this video is going to be slightly different than the ones that I've been doing lately. This is going to be more focused on those people that aren't quite ready for what's going on around us. I have heard from other people personally and seen online that now that people are starting to wake up, they're starting to feel afraid, a little panic going on. There's still some that are asleep, but many are starting to wake up and they feel that, well, I've waited too long, I'm not ready. And so that's really where the focus of this video is today. So I know many of you have already done all these things and you're ready, but this video is for those that aren't quite as ready. But don't click away just yet. This is a good one that I think you could share with people, share on your Facebook wall or with other social media that you're on, and try to help use this to calm their fears maybe a little bit, or at least give them some ideas of what they need to be doing right now to start to get ready for what's ahead. So, as you all know, and the subscribe and the share button, they're down below the video. You should be able to find them down there pretty easily. Well, it's a pandemic. That's right. Like anyone was really shocked. But officially today, the World Health Organization has declared a global pandemic. And it's like it took them long enough, right? There's a lot of political, meandering and, how they do things. And of course, it's all really based on financial gain. And that's really a big reason of why this is such a long delay. And we see governments like our own that seems to just be dragging their feet to the point of it being purposeful. And we see all around us in other countries that they're not just dealing with the pandemic, but they're dealing with extreme panic in a lot of places. And here in America, we have these outbreaks that are going on. As of the making of this video, the official infected account was almost 1,100. And I believe 31 casualties from that 1,100. There are most likely many, many more that are infected. And it's not because of, just because of them obviously hiding the numbers, and I believe there's a little bit of that going on. And it's not just because they're not getting enough test kits out there. Part of it is that's just how pandemics work and even widespread epidemics. They don't ever really know the full infected count until it's all said and done, usually years later, and there's studies done and they try to kind of figure out really how many people were infected. Take, for example, the Spanish flu. During the Spanish flu and immediately after, they claimed that there were probably about 8 to 9 million, maybe as high as 10 or 11 million that were infected globally, when in fact they did some studies, and that number has now been updated to somewhere between 50 and 75 million globally that were actually infected. So don't get so focused on necessarily the numbers, although it does start to show you how it is increasing, and it also can help you gauge how the public's perception of this. Because as those numbers start to increase rapidly, people are going to start taking more notice of this, and more people are going to come on board and realize that this is a little bit more serious and could become very, very serious. So just to kind of give you some update, especially if you're totally new and just kind of waking up to what's going on, I'm not going to fill you full of a lot of technical information, because it takes too long, and there's just so much out there. This has been going on for a few months now, and there's just too much to throw at you in one video. But to kind of break it down, number one, don't buy the lie that it's just the flu, or that it's less than the flu, or maybe it's slightly worse than the flu. That is not true by any means, shape, or form. We are seeing all over the world that it is much worse than the flu. It is much more contagious. There was an article that I read that there was some studies done on the saliva of immediately infected, or not immediately infected, but patients that were immediately after they started showing symptoms. And the saliva had 10,000 times the viral load of SARS patients, 10,000 times. So it's extremely contagious. Studies out of China showed that it is airborne, even though our own government is saying that they don't believe that it is. Chinese have already shown in studies that it is airborne. How about the thing of how it's only killing the old? Well, I addressed that yesterday in a video. Number one, why is it so okay that it's only killing the old? They're just as valuable as us middle-aged and the younger. So that's just a very harsh thing to even say. Secondly, it's not actually true. Italy's top ICU doctor, and they placed a doctor in charge of their ICU during this pandemic, and he did an interview yesterday, and he stated that the median age for people in the ICU is 65, that 50% of them were over 65 and 50% were younger than 65, and that they were starting to see, he said that yes, initially the group of people that were in the ICU were the older ones, but now that it's starting to kind of progress as a epidemic, that they're starting to see more and more patients that are in their 20s, 30s, and 40s coming in. And he said they have a patient, he was mentioning a specific patient that was only 20 years old, in perfect health, had no medical conditions, and was in full respiratory failure in an ICU unit. He said, so yes, it does affect everyone. And that it can cause casualties. Now, here's another thing to factor in. And you have to understand that a lot of the things that are being said about this are things that the Chinese came out with, that in their studies and what they have dealt with so far. And a lot of times we just take it at face value and don't really read of what they meant by what they said. So you hear that it typically, statistically, if you're older or that you have pre-existing medical conditions, that you are at high risk of casualty, of dying because of this virus. And so most people here in America, they think of, pre-existing conditions as like lung problems, smoking, diabetes, things like that. What they don't know is that in that report, the study that the Chinese did, it also included obesity. And the Chinese didn't focus so much on that because obesity is not really a problem in China. That's not something that they deal with a whole lot. Most of the Chinese are not obese. But they found that younger and middle-aged people that were obese had a fatality rate almost as high as folks 80 years old. And guess what? Almost 50% of the American population is considered obese. So let that sink in a little bit. When everyone's like, oh, I'm 30 years old, I'm 40 years old, I'm okay, I'm not really too worried about this. Are you overweight? Are you obese? Then maybe you should be worrying about this. So that is something that has been talked about. Now, put the virus aside, and we're already seeing shortages. We're seeing people obviously rush to the stores and buy up things. There are reports, although they're sporadic, but there's reports that banks are seeing an increased amount of people withdrawing cash. Obviously, the stock market is taking a horrible hit the last week and a half because of this. Shipping has gone down, manufacturing has gone down in places around the world. So we're seeing that there's a lot of things going on when it comes to the economy and industry, manufacturing, that's going to be affected by this. Several reports and articles have come out today. One he was a former CDC epidemiologist, and he's now working with the Washington State Health Department, currently in Seattle right now dealing with this. And he said that this virus is very much on par with the Spanish flu. He said he could be off. He said it's still early, so there's some of the data could be wrong. He says, but he's seeing it and everything and all the data that they're looking at, that it's very much on par and equal with the Spanish flu. That's pretty big. The Spanish flu killed 50 million people based on a population of about 1.3 billion globally. At 7.7 billion globally, that 50 million death will be much, much higher if it follows through with that. There's also all sorts of reports of that here in America that they're expecting to possibly infect 68 to 150 million people. If it infects 150 million people and the current death rate is 3.4%, you're looking at somewhere around anywhere between 3 and 5 million casualties in the United States. Will it be that high? Maybe not. But all I'm saying is that the numbers alone are telling us that this is much worse than the flu and should be taken seriously. But switching gears here, I don't want to cause panic. I don't want to cause fear, because that's not where we need to be. We need to not dwell on the fear and the panic, because there could be tough times ahead. But there are still time, while it may be small, there's still time for you to kind of start getting yourself prepared. So for those of you that aren't preppers, that's never really done anything to prepare, here are some tips that I would advise you. Number one, when it comes to food, you should try to acquire at least a 30-day supply of food, okay? And the reason why is because there's possible quarantines ahead. It's happening all over. There are several states that have declared a state of emergency, and there are quarantines already being in place. Italy is on a complete lockdown, and people are allowed to move about limitedly in their communities, but they must stay at home pretty much all the time. So you need enough supplies in your home to get you through 30 days, because you're not going to be sure of if you can get out and resupply, or if the supplies will even be there. So you need to start today. And I'm going to tell you this, based on what we've seen over the last week and a half, there's going to be a lot more people in the stores buying stuff up. So if you went to the store today or tomorrow, it's going to be pretty hard to find stuff. Things are going to start thinning out really quick. But there are some places that maybe you can go. A lot of people typically, first place they go is say a Walmart or a Costco or Sam's. And sometimes they forget about the small grocery stores, the little mom and pop places, dollar stores, places like that. Sometimes you're going to pay a little bit more, but right now, that's probably not your main focus. I understand that some of you just don't have the money to just go out and drop 30 days worth of food, but here's the deal. You're not gonna have to buy, you don't really need to buy the food that you're normally buying. So let's just say you normally spend $800 a month in groceries. Those are groceries that are kind of luxury items. A lot of them are. If you went out and bought 30 days of food to be locked in, kind of from a prepper mindset, you could do it for your whole family for probably less than $200. I've done it. I've bought a month's supply of food for less than $100 before. Some of those items are going to be hard to find right now. A lot of the bulk rices and beans and stuff are getting bought up, but still they're available. Places like Aldi that has more of kind of the warehouse style canned foods, where you can just buy a whole flat of canned foods. A lot of times you can still find them. I'm hearing reports that most of them are still in pretty good shape. So it doesn't take that much to buy up a bunch of canned food that'll get you through the month. You may not be eating the way you want to eat or have eaten in the past, but you can certainly survive. Other things that you need to look at. You need to look at things and keep this in mind, that if you have an outbreak in your area and the hospitals become overwhelmed, if you have a medical problem that's not related to the coronavirus, you probably don't want to go to the hospital, right? You probably don't want to go to the doctor. Now, if it's critical enough that it's truly life-threatening, then I guess you're going to have to make that decision to go. But a lot of times, it's not. A lot of times we go to the doctor because, well, that's just what we do. You need to look at some of the things that you can have in place to treat yourself at home. First aid supplies, certain over-the-counter medications. This also limits you having to go out again into public. And that's another thing you want to do. You want to do things right now, immediately, to keep from having to go into public as much. Of course, there's always Amazon, and they deliver to you. But a lot of supplies are even seeing shortages on Amazon. So there's no guarantee at what point those supplies really start thinning out. Because if everyone starts locking themselves in the house as much as possible, or at least limiting going out in public, they're going to start using Amazon a whole lot more. And so those supplies are going to start becoming more limited. But you need to try to have enough food, enough medicines, first aid supplies, of course toilet paper, and just other things that you need in your house that you use. Maybe it's personal hygiene, soap, laundry soap, shampoo, toothpaste, toothbrush, things like that. Go through your house, kind of gather things up, flashlights. If there was a power outage, although there's no indication that because of a pandemic there'll be a power outage, but what if it's just one of those things that just happens and it's during a pandemic? Maybe having some water set aside is a good idea. Having games and activities for the family, because if you're going to be at home a lot more, tensions are going to rise. You're going to, be around each other more. And there's going to be, there are the reports I've read out of China. I've read an article that husbands and wives, and this was a legitimate article. It wasn't meant to be as a joke, but that the divorce rate was already starting to increase, or people filing for divorces because husband and wives are finding that they just can't live with each other locked up in their house for 2 months. So you need to have things to do, coloring books for the kids, board games, card games, crafts, activities, books, movies to watch, that kind of stuff. These types of things can easily be done. Don't lose your mind. Look at the Spanish flu. It was horrible. It killed off nearly 10%, anywhere between 5 and 10% of the population at that time. And guess what? America didn't fail. Humanity didn't die. Things eventually picked up and they went on. Now there's other things that we could go into, and if you want to go back and watch some of my other videos recently, I'll go into those in those videos because I'm not doing it today. But there's certainly other things to worry about, long-term repercussions because of this, and certain things that could be put into place to just make this whole thing worse. But for right now, let's focus on just getting through the pandemic and possible quarantines that you might find yourself in. Another thing, as we're already seeing, the largest cities are starting to get hit first. And most likely, those are the cities that we're going to start looking like China and Italy. If you live in a large city and you have the ability to leave that for a while, I would suggest really thinking about that. Maybe you live in a big city and your parents live out in the country and you're able to go live with them for a few weeks. That might be a good idea if you're able to do it, because it's going to start getting a lot worse in the big cities. It'll probably eventually get out into the small towns and even into the countryside. The Spanish flu did the same thing. It eventually made it into the small towns and countryside. But I can assure you that the big cities are going to feel it worse, just simply because of the concentration of people. So in the end, use your head. This kind of stuff can be survivable. You just have to be smart. Limit your contact with other people. And they're saying 6 feet. The Chinese are saying it should be up to 12 feet. So do the things that you can do in your life, and it's going to be life-changing for sure, of cutting back on going out in public, cutting back on close contact with people. And right now, starting right now, if you have not done so, put everything you have into just getting yourselves ready. Get some food bought up, medical supplies, activities, first aid supplies, food for your animals, some water set aside, things like that. And from this point on, I would make sure you keep your tanks and your vehicles full at all times. Because you never know when there's a run on gas stations. You should also probably take some cash out of your bank and keep it set aside just in case. These are some tips that work really well for you beginners out there of preparing for something like that we're facing right now, a pandemic that has been acknowledged finally by the World Health Organization. All right, folks, thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.